Today we are going to learn how to recolor an object in Procreate, and we're going to go over 5 different methods that Procreate allows you to recolor a full object. So for this project, I'm starting on a new file, and I'm going to create 6 different versions of the same object, just colored using those 5 different methods plus the original one. So like I said, I'm working on something new, but I don't want to have to recut a new object. So I already have in my projects plenty of objects to choose from. So you can go into an old project, select a layer, click down on it, and you can copy just that layer. It'll tell you that it's copied. Now if I go back to my new project, I can hit on my layers, create a new one, and then hit on my actions tool. Make sure you have add, and then you can paste that in. So you see that I got this image from my other file. It's transparent still, so it copied that layer, and I want to size this down. So I'm going to take this, make sure uniform is hit at the bottom so the proportions are saved. Move this over and see if you can fit about 6 of these objects onto your page. Alright. So, once you've sized it down, I'm going to rename this. This is going to be my goldfish. And this is the original color. So you can also say or call it the original. So whatever object you have, you can just call it the original one. Notice in the sample here, we're going to change it using hue, saturation, and brightness, color balance, curves, gradient map, and then we're going to do a color drop and the recolor option. So right now, I just have my singular original goldfish here. I'm going to make sure that there are 6 total copies of this. So I'm just going to duplicate it until there are 6 of them. And we'll deal with them one at a time. So the first one that we're going to edit is going to be using the hue, saturation, and brightness. So I'm going to take one of these layers. Doesn't matter which one. I will go into my transform tool and just move it over slightly. If you have snapping turned on at the bottom with magnetics and snapping, that's a good way to make sure things are lined up. So if I would like this object to be lined up with my first one, then I can turn on that feature, and when these 3 horizontal lines appear, that means that it's in line with that. So I will use that just to make sure that things are lined up, but it's not necessary, just makes things a little bit neater for us. As I said, the first option we're going to do is using hue, saturation, and brightness. So I'm going to rename that so I don't get confused. So hue, saturation, you can just say sat, and brightness. So hue, saturation, and brightness now. Now, most of what we're going to do is going to appear up at the top using our adjustments tool. And yours might look different than mine, but there is going to be one called hue, saturation, and brightness. So you're going to click on that. You have the option of layer or pencil, and I like to just deal with the layers. So hue, saturation, and brightness brings up this menu at the bottom. Hue is essentially the name of a color. We already have an orange fish, so even though it's pointing at blue, that's just like what it presets as. So as I switch it around, even though it looks like it should turn blue now, you see that it's turning green instead. So just kind of play around until you get a good color that you like. So about here is a nice color for me. I think that's a good base color instead of what we had. Notice that the fins also change at the same time. So As I move this, the main body changes, but so do the fin colors. Next we have saturation in the middle. And saturation, you can see, can make things really dull, or they can make them very vibrant, different than bright. But it was set to about 50. I think I can lower it down a little bit so it's not quite as obnoxious. You can decide what looks best for you. If you play with saturation and you want to make an object black and white, you just take this all the way down and now you have a black and white object. So that's a quick way to change that if that's something you'd want in yours. There's also a cool effect where you can make things look kind of sepia toned. So you can take this and you can make it look kind of like it's faded instead. So change the hue, change the saturation to something that looks nice, and finally brightness. So brightness you can bring up or down, that's the value of it. So brightness all the way up, brightness all the way down. Again, you want to find a good balance for that. And there you go, hue, saturation, and brightness. Now if you tap on the screen, so just tap with a finger on the screen, it should bring up this secondary cross menu. So you can undo things that you've done while in here. You can preview them. If I click on preview, you can see what it used to look like versus what it looks like now. You can apply and it'll keep you in this menu, but you can make sure that those changes are already set. You can cancel, it'll get rid of everything, or you can reset. So if I reset everything, you see that it goes back to its normal state, its original state. So let me just make those adjustments quickly again. And I can hit apply if I want to, so tap and apply. You'll see I'm still in this menu though, so if I want to do something else, I'll have to click somewhere else. So I'm going to label this. So in my painting or in my inking, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to label that this one was my hue, saturation, and brightness fish, or whatever you made. So remember, you can hold down to grab a color. So I'll grab a color here and label this hue, saturation, and brightness. So this one is fairly straightforward, pretty easy to do. Again, it turns things black and white very fast and easy, so if you think about turning something black and white, then that one's great. Okay, so moving right along, we're going to work on the next layer. So again, I'll just grab one of those, use my transform tool to move it over, wait till it's all lined up. And this one, we are going to use color balance on. So I've renamed it color balance. Once again, we're going to go up at the top in adjustments, hit on color balance, and then layer. And now you can see another menu at the bottom. So there are several different things you can do with the color balance. You can move things redder or more cyan, green or magenta, and yellow or blue. But that only deals with one part at a time. So unlike in hue, saturation, and brightness, you can deal with the shadows, midtones, and highlights separately if you click on that little sun. So let's say that I want my shadows to be a little bit bluer, so I'll move that along. Cyan is also kind of a blue color, so we'll move that. I can adjust if I want the shadows to look more green-blue, if I want them to look more like blue-violet. Next, I'll move on to the midtones. So in between here. And finally, I'll go on to my highlights. And that will change quite a bit of this. You can always do the same thing multiple times. So if I hit on apply, I can go further on this. So I'll tap, hit apply, and then I can just keep kind of shifting things along to make it even more dramatic. So this one takes a little bit more tweaking, and you may want to do it several times. Usually turns out pretty nice though. Okay, so I think I'm good with this now. Again, I'll tap somewhere else, so I'll go into my brush and I will label this. I like to just grab a color that's being used on the actual image that I did. So grab from under here. And like I said, for this one, we did a color balance. Same process. I'm just going to go down the list here. If you already know what to rename it, then that's great. So I'm going to rename this next one Curves. And I'm going to move it downwards. See that the line is up vertical now, so I can make sure to just pull that right under there. Leave enough room that you can label pretty easily. And like I said, we're going to be using curves on this one. So hit adjustments and then curves. Now for me, curves is really great. Hit layer again, but looks very confusing if you're using this for the first time. So on here you have almost like a map, and there are 4 buttons on the side. So there's gamma, red, green, blue. So red, green, and blue, you can tell from when we use the other one, color balance, those are your main colors that are possible on screens. Kind of confusing. So RBG, if you've heard that before. So let's start with gamma, which is a combination of all 3. This just kind of messes with how light and dark things are. So we can play around with these dots. So if I start at the top dot right here, you could make things really, really bright by moving that more towards the center. Or if I hit on the bottom dot, if I move that more towards the center, it gets very dark. I can move this up and the whole thing kind of gets lighter. If I move this down, the whole thing gets darker. So instead of messing with the ends of this, you can actually click on that line and it'll create a new dot. The reason that this is called curves is that we can curve this line. So instead of trying to make things lighter on the ends, you want to do it more in the middle. So I'm going to push my fish a little bit lighter, so a little higher. If I wanted to push it darker, I would make it darker. So I'm going to push this a little bit brighter so that the highlights really stand out. If you want to make the highlights brighter and the shadows dark at the same time, you can add another dot and kind of push that. And usually this curve looks pretty nice. Right now it's very dramatic and it doesn't look the best, so if you click on a dot, you can delete it. So if you don't feel like you need to make any changes, you can just leave it alone and delete it. I do, so I will add one and just push it slightly up. Next, we're going to actually change the colors. So if you saw before, the opposite of red is going to be cyan. So I can make things more cyan by pushing the red down at the top. Or I can make things more red by moving this over. The bottom will do something kind of similar. So if I move this up, the shadows will get more red. If I move this down, the shadows will get more cyan. So the top and bottom really represent the highlights and the shadows. So the top controls the highlights of this. I'd like this to be way less red. And the bottom controls the shadows, which are already kind of blue. So I'm just going to push them a little bit further. You can also add a dot in the middle to make things generally more red or generally more cyan. So we'll mess around with that. Green is your next one, so I can make things greener, or I can make them the opposite of green. In light is going to be magenta, so you can kind of see that that adds a magenta hue to it. And then blue. The opposite of blue here is going to be yellow, so I can make things bluer, or I can make things more yellow. So I would like my shadows bluer. I would like this generally just very blue. And once again, if it doesn't look good after my first batch, I can still edit a little bit more. I can hit on apply and I will like kind of restart. Alright, so play around with your curves and see how you like using that. Okay. Once again, I'll label this. And we'll move on to the next one. So the last option on the adjustments is called your gradient map. So let's move this one over, line it up with both if that works for you, or you can just kind of drop it in. It doesn't really matter if they're perfectly lined up or not. So, gradient map. So click up at the top and hit on gradient map layer again. And this time you will be taken to a gradient library, which is very confusing. We're going to make a new one. And at this point, it'll just change it to black and white. So what this also does affects the highlights and the shadows and midtones separately. So right now it's saying that my highlight, the brightest area on my fish, is going to be white. I don't want the brightest area on my fish to be white. Let's say that I would like it to be this very bright kind of blue color. So I will select that super bright, very pretty blue color. And it's saying that my shadows are going to be black. Again, I don't really want my shadows to be black. So if I want to make them kind of like a deep purple color, I can move and choose that color there. I can make my shadows really bright. Normally you want to stick with something darker for the shadows and something a lot lighter for the highlights. So my highlights are kind of bright. I can push them even brighter. And it creates a gradient for me. So from light to dark, you can see that my highlights are the first color that I chose and my shadows are that. In between there, it'll use the colors that are in between. So I can add a dot just like I did with my curves to act kind of like my midtones. And let's say that generally I want the middle of this fish to be very pink. So I'll move this over and I will change it to a bright kind of pink color. Whoops. Or let's play around and add a color that isn't even there. So I can make my fish mostly green if I want to. I can make it back to orange. Doesn't really matter what you choose as long as you've decided that's what you'd like the majority of your fish to look like or whatever object you have. I can go back into my shadows. So hit that last one and let's push those shadows into a different color. So let's make those really kind of purple. Let's make my highlights really nice and blue. So these different squares represent the different values that are on my fish. If I want there to be more of this cyan color, I can move my square over and that'll increase how much that color is affecting. So I'm kind of taking my highlights and moving them along. I can take my midtones and I can also move them. So I can say I would like a lot of the things that are brighter. So moving along towards the right makes the brighter ones turn this color. Moving along towards the left affects the darker ones. And you can add as many of these as you want to. Just some of them look kind of unnatural and some of them will look a little bit better. So if I want to make this generally a kind of duller fish, then I'll move and change my color and make it a little bit duller. And that tends to look a lot nicer as well. So that was how to use the gradient map. Kind of confusing, but again, you just really want to play around with it. Usually you want your right color to be very bright and your left color to be very dark. You can add as many things as you want to in between there to make it look as pretty as you think it should. Okay, again, you can hit apply or you can just switch to a different tool and that will take you out of there. And for this we use the gradient map. So all these ways of recoloring have involved us using the adjustments tool. So hue, saturation, brightness, color balance, curves, gradient map. The last way that I'm going to show you how to affect things is by doing a recolor and using the color drop option. So that's our last one. So take the next top layer, and this is going to be a color drop and recolor. Take that, move that all the way to the bottom there. Okay, so now that I'm in my color drop and recolor layer, I can show you two ways to do kind of a faster recolor. So if I wanted to make this fish blue, I would pick a nice blue color. And quickly I can take from the top and just kind of drag it and drop it here. And you can see some things have changed depending on where you hit on there. At the top, you'll see that a menu pops up to continue filling with recolor. So I can open this up and you see this kind of crosshair thing open. And it asks you essentially where you want to target. So I'm going to target an area and change that color. So if I still want the same fish to be blue, then I'll pick a different area that didn't get covered. And I can increase the flood on that, and you can see that it's now covering more areas. You can even change the color. So if I want this to be kind of the shadows, then I'll make this a kind of darker color, maybe even move it and slide it along. And there's that. So again, a quick way to recolor something is just to kind of drag and drop that color into where you want it. When you drag and drop at the top, it'll let you adjust the threshold. So if you don't let go, it will open up this menu. You can decide like how much of this you want it to affect. So that's what that does for you. But I think that this is a pretty fun and easy way to recolor something. So again, you just choose the color at the top, drag it kind of where you think it should be. If you drag and hold it, then you can adjust the threshold of it. So you can bring it all the way and it'll affect kind of a lot. If you kind of drop it in there and it doesn't look complete, you can continue filling with the recolor. Choose another, maybe a brighter one this time. Target a different spot. And you can see that you can change the flood of this and you can change the color of it at the same time. So both of those things can happen simultaneously. So play around with what looks really good to you. And afterwards, if you want to make more adjustments, you can totally do that kind of on your own. And again, this last one was we started with a color drop. And then we use the recolor on top of that, or in addition to it. Okay. So you should have all 6 of these images, including the first one, which is just the original. So I'll go in there and I'll mark that this is the original one. It's nice that we changed the color into something that's kind of not recognizable from the original. So I didn't just go in and make it like a brighter orange, but I really just changed the color up. What's nice about this is that we've affected like the whole object, like I told you. If we want to, you can also do this in parts. So one of the things I like to do when I'm recoloring something is I'll always make sure to duplicate it first, because I don't want the original to completely go away if I want to use it again. So I always make copies. But you'll see if I just want to change something like the fin, I can go into my select tool up at the top, hit on freehand and add, and let's add in that fin, and I only want to change that color, then I can do that any of the ways that I told you. So you can go into your adjustments and you can go and make that black and white, let's say. So I can just take its saturation down if I'd like to. I can cancel that. I can drag and drop another color in there or hit any of those things, and you see that the rest of my fish is unaffected. So if there's a singular part of an object that you'd like to change up, then that's absolutely possible for you. And there are plenty of other ways that you can go about this. So use these in combination and see what works and see what doesn't work at the same time. I want you to experiment with combining these and getting the effect that you think will fit your project the best. Make sure all of these are labeled appropriately and take a screenshot. You should be nice and organized, and then you should be ready to go.